Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Confessions of an Egyptologist, Lost Libraries, Vanished Labyrinths, and the Astonishing Truth Under the Saqqara Pyramids, by Erich von Däniken. Narrated by Charles Constant. Chapter 1. The Murder. On November 17th, 1997, an attack took place in front of the Hatshepsut Temple in Luxor that resulted in the hideous murder of unarmed tourists by cowardly Islamist psychopaths. The drama started at 9 a.m. as the early November sun burned down on the Nile Valley near Luxor. The first tourists were waiting at the ticket booth by Queen Hatshepsut's temple complex. They had come to marvel at the unique gravesite. Information above the little window showed the current admission prices, and to the left was a copy of an engraving from the temple that read, "Built as a monument to Amun, Lord of the Two Thrones, Amun is the most holy one." Suddenly, 6 young bearded Arabs stood in front of the ticket clerk, who looked up in astonishment, expecting them to ask about tickets. Then one of the 6 men opened his jacket, pulled out a Kalashnikov, and shot the clerk and 2 inspectors standing next to him, killing all 3. The tourists in the queue started to scatter, but it was too late. Whole groups of them were simply mowed down. Even after 45 minutes, there was neither a policeman nor any military personnel on the premises. No siren sounded. No military helicopter appeared. The cold-blooded killers had a free hand to target individuals or groups who were trying to escape or hide. The echo of the victims' screams rang from the temple walls to the rocky sides of the valley that enclosed the site. When they were done shooting, the terrorists began massacring their victims with machetes, all in the name of Allah. They placed a message praising Islam in the hacked-open body of a Japanese visitor. A 5-year-old British boy and a couple on their honeymoon were also slaughtered. A 45-year-old woman from Freiburg, Switzerland, threw herself protectively over her daughter, held her tight, and closed her eyes. But when the rattle of the automatic weapons finally stopped, blood flowed from the child's face. Murdered. 23-year-old Manuela Kamuff from Lörrach pretended to be dead, lying beside her father, Karl Heinz. Several shots had ripped his face apart. The result of this horror? 58 tourists dead, including 36 Swiss, 10 Japanese, 6 British, 4 German, and 2 Colombian. In addition, 4 Egyptians, 3 police officers, and a tour guide were killed. That tour guide was my friend, Adel H, and this book is about him. Adel and I were friends who had shared a great deal of knowledge about some of Egypt's millennia-old secrets, those under the Saqqara Pyramid and those under the Sphinx. On many nights we had talked about the administrators within the Egyptian civil service hierarchy and their connections to archaeologists. Adel let me know in no uncertain terms that he shouldn't be having these conversations, especially not with me. He counted on my discretion. Over 20 years have passed since Adel's murder. On that fateful morning, Adel accompanied a group of Swiss tourists from the Hotel Meridian in Luxor to the boat that would take them across the Nile, and then, on the other side of the river, to the modern air-conditioned bus that would carry them to the mortuary temple. As I later learned from a survivor, the mood on board was relaxed and friendly. Everyone was looking forward to seeing Queen Hatshepsut's temple, which stood directly at the bottom of the steep rock face of the Theban desert mountains. Adel prepared his group for their experience by giving them some background and history over the bus's loudspeakers. Hatshepsut, he told them, had ruled Egypt for 20 years. Illustrations and statues show her as a stately figure dressed in male robes with a beard and the insignia of the ruler. But Hatshepsut was, in fact, a woman. Was she the world's first transgender person? It's possible. When Pharaoh Thutmose II of the 18th dynasty died in 1479 BC, his son Thutmose III should have inherited the throne, but he was still a child. His stepmother, Hatshepsut, ascended the throne instead, and eventually had herself crowned pharaoh. She also created a myth about her alleged divine origin, claiming she had been created by the god Amun. After her death, the rightful heir, Thutmose III, finally became pharaoh and ruled for 33 years. Adel explained to the tourists that the temple they would arrive at in a few minutes was one of the greatest achievements of the New Kingdom. The architects who had worked there millennia ago had created a structure that consisted of 3 harmoniously layered terraces. Hatshepsut probably chose the location because, centuries earlier, a sanctuary of Hathor, goddess of fertility, love, art, and science, had stood there. The temple itself was built at the end of a kilometer-long processional road that had originally been flanked on both sides by stone sphinxes. This avenue of sphinxes had once led beyond this temple site to the Amun-Re site in Karnak, over 12 kilometers away in a straight line. These sphinxes were hybrid beings, like the famous sphinx in front of the Great Pyramid, the largest of its type. Today tourists can still walk a 3-kilometer sphinx-lined avenue that connects the temples of Luxor and Karnak. The temple of Hatshepsut is intersected by a sloping ramp that connects the second of its 3 terraces with the third. At the end of the ramp on the third terrace, there are 12 columns on each side. Behind them, on the temple wall, reliefs survive that depict scenes from a distant past. One shows a trip from the Nile to the mysterious land of Punt. Another tells the story of the creation of Hatshepsut by the god Amun. Yet another portrays the facial features of Hatshepsut herself, with a painted beard and the insignia of royalty. According to Adel, 2 statues of the god Osiris, each 5.5 meters tall, originally stood in front of the pillars of the top terrace. Queen Hatshepsut herself appears in 9 colossal statues and no fewer than 26 smaller ones. The temple is truly a monument for eternity. The tourist bus reached the site's parking lot at 9:12 a.m. Adel asked the members of his group to reassemble at the same place in 2 hours. He stayed at the bus door until the last guests had left the vehicle. As his tourist group crossed the 200 meters between the parking lot and the ticket booth, Adel heard the first shots. He ran past his group, saw one of the killers with his Kalashnikov, and shouted something at him in Arabic, probably, "What are you doing?" or "In the name of Allah, stop." One survivor told me that the terrorist merely grinned, then raised his gun and blasted his countryman and fellow believer Adel away with several shots. The authorities later revealed which terrorist group had committed this act, who had trained them, and who was behind it. I didn't care anymore. When their heinous attack subsided, the terrorists stole a bus and continued their murderous rampage at the next temple, where an exchange of gunfire with police ensued. One of the attackers was shot, the others escaped into a cave. There, encircled by the army that had by that time moved in, they reportedly committed suicide. Personally, I don't believe a word of it. The security forces wiped out the terrorists as they cowered in that cave because their statements would not have been allowed to be aired in any court in the land or revealed to the world at large. These assassins had defiled the name of Allah. They would have told lies in the name of Allah. Clearly, these deluded murderers didn't even know their own holy book, the Quran. If they did, they would have known that Allah, who is worshipped several times a day, does not need the help of murderers to enforce his will. Surah 2, verse 118 of the Holy Book tells us, "If Allah wants something, He only thinks it is, and it will happen." If Allah didn't want tourists visiting Egypt, or didn't want His faith and its monuments shared with non-believers, He would only have to think, "So it is," and immediately so it would be. To think that Allah is so small and powerless that He needs the help of fanatics is an insult to the grand Creator. What troubles me is that well-known mullahs never come before their believers after a gross act of violence committed in Allah's name and make it unmistakably clear that Allah does not condone murder, that those who support or commit assassinations are never acting in His name. The world has, in fact, become immersed in these lies, particularly with regard to religion. Chapter 2. First Encounter. Our imaginations are intrigued by civilizations that flourished millennia ago. Why? Because the writings of these cultures either no longer exist or are slumbering in secret archives somewhere. Archaeology succeeds in bringing some order and understanding to this distant past, but with that order, new questions arise. Today we know that, to date, only about 20% of all Egyptian antiquities have been excavated. But how many of us are aware that there are chambers under the Great Pyramid of Giza, or that new shafts, chambers, and corridors are located and electronically measured every year in the same pyramid, or that the so-called pyramid texts from the 2nd and 3rd dynasties of Egypt tell us not only about the wishes of a pharaoh for the afterlife, but also about actual space flights by ancient rulers, or that the Egyptians mummified myriad animals, including millions of birds and hundreds of thousands of crocodiles, bulls, hippos, and snakes, as well as smaller creatures like beetles, scorpions, rats, and fish. How many are aware that ancient Egyptians, those who lived 2,500 or more years ago, did not themselves know who built the Great Pyramid, or that Caliph Abdullah al-Mamun, the first to enter the pyramid in 832 AD after it had been sealed for thousands of years, discovered inside it the body of a human-like being wearing armor made of an unknown metal, along with strange stones and unidentifiable objects? These questions are perplexing, but even more perplexing is that these facts are not publicly known. Egypt is open to tourists. Anyone can travel there and be astonished by what they see. That's why I take small groups of curious people there every few years, hoping that they will become enlightened and pursue more knowledge about Egypt's ancient civilization. And, of course, every study group is accompanied by a trained expert in Egyptology. And that's how I first met Adel H. in the fall of 1981. The conversation begins. Adel introduced himself as I rode the bus to my hotel. He was humble, not intrusive, a lean, tall figure with somber facial features and black hair. Unlike most Egyptians, he had no beard or mustache. His teeth were well maintained and his smile was natural. He didn't try to overwhelm tourists with unnecessary talk and arrogance, and he never tried to force knowledge on them in which they weren't interested. He just patiently answered their questions. He knew Egypt and its people and instructed us competently about the laws and religions of the Nile region. Although Muslim, he drank red wine with his guests in small sips. As I got to know Adel, I asked him who had assigned him to our group. Did tour guides have any kind of governing body that decided who would lead a specific group? I wanted to have this group, Adel replied. My wish was to meet you. He looked me straight in the eye. There was a tourist office somewhere in Cairo, he told me, with a canteen for the tour guides. Incoming parties were listed on a large message board along with information like arrival and departure dates, number of participants, tour operator, category, boat or bus trip, moderate, luxurious, language, average age of participants, etc. When he saw my name listed with one group, he ran straight to his supervisor and requested that he lead our tour. The supervisor stared at him for a long time and finally asked whether he knew who I was, warning him that I had a reputation for being quite well informed and for contradicting the local travel guides. Adel told his boss that he knew of my books and was not afraid of my possible know-it-all attitude any more than he was bothered by the uninformed questions of the other tour members. "Where did you learn to speak German so perfectly?" I asked him after he had explained. "I studied for 4 years at the Institute for Egyptology at the University of Vienna," Adel replied. "I also studied epigraphy, German, and of course hieroglyphic texts and monuments. And, believe it or not," he went on, "I actually attended one of your lectures at the university. You even signed one of your books for me, but you will probably not remember that." On subsequent evenings, usually after the tourists had retired to their quarters, Adel and I often met at the bar in the Hotel Semiramis, which is not far from the pyramids. Slowly I began to realize why Adel was interested in me. He saw in me a theoretician, a bookworm who had access to ancient texts. He, on the other hand, was a practitioner. He dug in the field, crawled into abandoned shafts, and also worked with grave robbers. When I expressed my surprise that a legitimate Egyptologist and officially recognized tour guide would work with grave robbers, he told me about the relationships that existed between the Razuls, a long-established grave robber clan, and the archaeological community. In fact, in the fall of 1922, it was young Ahmed Razul who led British archaeologist Howard Carter to the burial chamber of Tutankhamun. When Adel inquired if I knew the story of Howard Carter, I replied that I was familiar with only the barest details of his work. "What you know is probably just the public version," Adel said with a smile. "Howard Carter wasn't the innocent academic we know from the textbooks. He had worked as an inspector for the Antiquity Administration for Upper Egypt and Nubia since 1899, and during this time also worked with grave robbers. Carter probably couldn't have made his historic discovery in any other way," Adel claimed, because professional archaeology was just emerging as a legitimate field at the time. In fact, from 1904 to 1908, Carter worked as a painter, a tourist guide, and an interpreter in Luxor, during which time he received antiquities from the Razzles and sold them to tourists. Carter returned to Luxor from England in late October 1922, Adel continued, armed with the financial support of a wealthy Englishman, Lord Carnarvon. In early November, as Carter was excavating the tomb of Ramses VI in the Valley of the Kings, he came across a cartouche of the god Anubis and sent a telegram about it to his sponsor in London. "I know the text from my time at the university," Adel reported. "Made at last wonderful discovery in the valley. A magnificent tomb with seals intact, recovered same for your arrival. I have it sealed again for your arrival." "But that telegram was a lie," Adel insisted, smiling in a forgiving way and sipping his wine. Ahmed Razzul, one of the sons of the grave robber family, had actually led Howard Carter to this tomb days earlier. After receiving this telegram, Carter's sponsor, Lord Carnarvon, promptly traveled to Egypt, and together, before the eyes of journalists and some experts, they presided over an official opening of the tomb. Witnesses reported at the time that some workers pushed stone slabs to the side, and Carter held a torch into a crack. The anxious Lord Carnarvon, standing behind him, couldn't wait any longer and asked impatiently, "What do you see?" Carter replied calmly, "I see incredible things." But again, Carter was lying, Adel asserted. He had been in the tomb days earlier, led by Ahmed Razzul. He probably took some treasures so he would not have to share them with the government. When I asked why he would do that, Adel responded that Carter's agreement obliged him to leave half of the treasures to the Egyptians, and he wanted his share. An inventory of the find, taken years later, showed that there were exactly 5,398 objects in Tutankhamun's tomb, the best known being the young king's golden death mask, which is shown today in special exhibitions around the world. The incredible story that Adel told me back in 1981 was confirmed 5 years later by Egyptologist Dr. Rolf Krauss. Howard Carter lost his interest in scientific archaeology after the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. He no longer wanted to have anything to do with the Antiquities Administration in Cairo, and he often scolded them publicly. He went on to earn a livelihood from lectures and juicy commissions as an art dealer. He died of a lung disease on March 2, 1939, at his home in Kensington, England. Journalists at the time wrote of a curse of the pharaohs. Considering Adel's revelation that the most famous discoverer of Egyptian antiquities, one of the world's most admired archaeologists, was in fact a grave robber, I shook my head in dismay. "I'm an Egyptologist and tour guide as well," Adel countered, "and I can't get anywhere without the grave robbers. For better or worse, they are part of our society." "Have you ever sold real antiquities?" I inquired. "Yes," he replied. "I couldn't do it any other way." "So you know tombs that have not yet been discovered archaeologically?" "Not only that," he assured me. "My family knows of spacious underground structures that must date from a time so far back that we can't even grasp it, tens of thousands of years ago or more." I did not contradict him, but instead asked if I could possibly see at least parts of these structures. I explained to him that I was familiar with some ancient books that were written 2,000 or more years ago that reported on the existence of underground labyrinths. The ancient authors even talked about the age of these labyrinths, placing them so far back in time as to amaze and puzzle today's archaeologists. And I couldn't help but wonder under which deserts, settlements, or sanctuaries these labyrinths might be hidden. Where were these lost underground worlds from distant times? Had they been excavated and then covered up again? If so, by whom? Had these long-forgotten structures become inaccessible due to natural disasters? And where are the millions of books that were written in that distant past? Were they burned, damaged, deliberately destroyed? And if so, why? Is the little that we see today all that there is? Or do secret libraries exist, accessible only to hooded guards or members of obscure orders? Who actually had an interest in writing, hoarding, and then hiding books for millennia? Who wanted to make these books disappear again? Did Adel actually know of lost libraries? Had the clan of grave robbers discovered chambers or even halls filled with treasures that were thousands of years old and remained silent about them? Was Adel an initiate of one of these groups? And, if so, why was he sharing this knowledge with me? Kindred Spirits. In March 1984, I invited Adel and his wife to spend 2 weeks with me in Switzerland, where we spent many afternoons in my archive, of which I am very proud. It houses over 100,000 pictures that are neatly organized and stored in drawers, along with my correspondence with famous and lesser-known people from all over the world. One afternoon, as we pored over my collection, seated at my conference table, sipping strong black tea and smoking, I asked Adel, "Why are there no Arabic versions of any of my books?" I showed him translations of my work into Chinese, Japanese, Tamil, Russian, and of course English, French, and Spanish. "What do the Arabs have against me?" "I don't think they have anything against you," Adel replied. "They don't know anything about you. It is rather the Islamic clergy who condemn your works." "But why? I make it clear in every book that I am a deeply religious person." "But in your books you write about gods, plural," Adel pointed out. "This is not at all compatible with the Quran. Think of the prayers that are sung 6 times a day from the minaret. La ilaha illallah Muhammadan Rasulullah. Allah is great and Muhammad is his prophet. There must be no gods besides Allah." "But my so-called gods aren't gods at all," I protested. "In fact, there are no gods. We know that today, although our Stone Age ancestors didn't." I explained that our ancestors viewed extraterrestrials as deities, and that was how the belief in gods came about. "Everything is just a huge misunderstanding," I exclaimed. "The gods were, in fact, extraterrestrial astronauts." "You don't have to explain that to me," laughed Adel. "But try to convince the Muslim clergy." We later decided that Adel should translate one of my books from German into High Arabic to increase the chance that an Arab publishing house might become interested in my work. Adel worked diligently on this project, and the translation was completed 6 months later. But we still couldn't find a buyer. Adel spoke to several academic and intellectually curious publishers, including some who had studied in the West. But nobody wanted to take the risk. Everyone was afraid of the mullahs, who feared a kind of spiritual revolution, an uprising by the faithful against the Holy Quran. Although I decried this attitude, I understood it very well. After all, I was familiar with the long, painful history of the destruction of millions of books. As Adel and I pondered these difficult subjects, I realized that I had found in Adel a kindred spirit and a fellow investigator. And that was when I decided that I would pass on to him all the knowledge that I had collected over decades and published in stages in previous books. And Adel's curiosity and amazement only increased in the telling. What do we actually know, we asked each other, about the unknown writers who worked millennia ago and the legacy they may have left? Gifts from the Gods. The entire history of our intellectual past began with the awakening of the mind. Our former monkey-like ancestors communicated through grunts and hisses. Then they developed language, which, according to my research, arose from a targeted artificial mutation brought forth by extraterrestrials visiting the Earth. Science rejects this theory, however, and claims that language evolved through natural changes. At some point in the process, people learned to count using their fingers and toes, placing stones together in groups to denote larger quantities of animals and goods. At about this time, humans began building temples and priests began demanding sacrifices, which had to be tallied as well. After rudimentary language and the ability to count, humans developed pictorial signs, today known as pictograms, to express more complicated thoughts and meanings. Then, as early as the 4th millennium BC, abstract signs emerged from wedge-shaped marks that combined to create the first written language, cuneiform. The largest cuneiform library found to date is that of King Ashurbanipal, who ruled the Assyrian Empire from 669 to 631 BC. His huge collection was found in the 19th century in the hills of Kujunshik near the former city of Nineveh, now in northern Iraq near Mosul. During his reign, Ashurbanipal had no fewer than 25,000 clay tablets inscribed, each of which contained his name. These include a copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh, a Babylonian creation myth known as the Enuma Elish, and a copy of the Codex Hammurabi, a collection of laws that the Babylonian king Hammurabi had ordered chiseled on stone tablets that made explicit reference to divine revelations. Ashurbanipal, who ruled around 1,000 years after Hammurabi, must have been a very learned ruler. He had older texts from distant libraries copied by his own scribes and brought to Nineveh, and also confiscated entire clay tablet collections on his military campaigns. He prided himself on being able to write and claimed to be familiar with the science of reading signs in the sky. He also claimed to know the writings from before the time of the Great Flood. Contrary to current scientific views that cuneiform writing developed over a millennia-long process, the learned writers of the time report something different. They claim the script was given to mankind by the gods. Diodorus of Sicily, who lived in the 1st century BC and spent several years in Alexandria, writes that people first lived in a disorderly and semi-animalistic state. They searched for food independently and only worked together when they were attacked by wild animals. At first, their language consisted of a variety of different sounds, but they gradually learned to assign certain sounds, words, to certain objects. During this period of human development, the gods suddenly arrived and encouraged humans to give up their primitive means of survival and instructed them in the skills of mining, agriculture, and husbandry. They taught them how to grow wheat and barley and how to raise certain animals as a source of food in lean times. Lastly, the gods gave a lot of names to things for which no name was known, and then they taught a few people to write. Several of the ancient writers, including Berosus, a priest of Babylon who lived in the 4th century BC, agree with Diodorus's interpretation of the early development of human society. Berosus wrote a 3-volume history called the Babyloniaca, of which only a few original fragments remain. We owe what little we know of this critical early work to descriptions by Alexander Polyhistor, church dignitary Eusebius of Caesarea, and Jewish historian Flavius Josephus. According to surviving portions of the work, Berosus tells of how humans were originally instructed by gods. In the first year, an intelligent creature with the name Oannes arose out of the Eritrean Sea, today the Arabian Sea. This creature spent the daytime with people without eating, and passed on its knowledge of writing, science, and other arts to them, and taught them how to build cities and temples, how to introduce laws, and how to survey the land. Since that time, people have not learned anything that is significantly new. Depending on the translation, Oannes is interpreted as fish creature, wise man, or scholar. It is astonishing that a similar teacher named Ima appears in the holy book of the Parsi, the Avesta. And even old Chinese traditions speak of a heavenly teacher who brought writing to people. Japanese creation myths include similar descriptions. In fact, ancient historians across many cultures reported that it was the gods who taught people to write. In the 5th volume of his lengthy history, the bishop and historian Eusebius reports on the Chaldeans. And in the first year a terrible monster arose from the Arabian Sea, in the middle of the Babylonian region, with the voice of a human, whose image and drawing are still kept. The same animal spent its day with the humans without eating any kind of food, and it taught people writing and the various arts. But whether language and writing were gifts from the gods or the product of evolution, hundreds of thousands of volumes were created in the ancient world. In Egypt, these were written in hieroglyphs, which first appeared as early as 3200 BC in the so-called Prince's Tomb of Naquadah III. This form of writing, which originally developed out of an earlier pictorial script, made use of nearly 7,000 hieroglyphic characters by around 600 BC. In fact, the word hieroglyph means sacred character in ancient Greek, and the Egyptians themselves called their hieroglyphs script of the godly words. According to their tradition, it was Thoth, the god of wisdom, who taught them the script. Ancient Archives. The Egyptians wrote on everything, temple walls, pillars, ceilings, and even deep inside the pyramids. There, for example in the tombs of Unas, the walls were completely covered with inscriptions. In an important step forward, the
Sample complete. Ready to continue?